Hello everyone, today we talk about the so-called kingdom, in fact first principality and then kingdom chronologically as we will see, of Galicia-Volhynia, existing in fact as a principality from the late 12th century and becoming a kingdom in 1253, known in fact as Galicia-Volhynskie Kniazevstvo, as properly kingdom of Galicia and Volhynia, in Latin Regnum Galiciae et Lodomeria, and also known in part historiographically as the Kingdom of Ruthenia, broadly speaking, so Korolevsko Rusi and Regnum Rusiae. And it was an important medieval state in this high and late medieval time that came to fall eventually under the orbit of the Golden Horde. It was centered, in fact, on the regions of Galicia and Volhynia, known also as the Rusian Palatinate, because these were some of the most advanced areas of the Kievan Rus. We also made some modern contemporary history of Galicia and Volhynia in our Ukrainian history playlist. And its independence terminated in 1349 when he was occupied, properly controlled by Poland. Right, it was actually divided between Lithuania and Poland, as we'll see now. And looking at the map of today's states, it would extend on, let's say, in the core area, mostly today's Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, and also stretching importantly also east and south, in part also north. As we will see, it had many different neighbors of many different cultures, and therefore quite an interesting international situation that they used to play after the disgregation of the Kievan Rus because of the Mongol invasion, to trying to autonomize their power and ending up, however, to be absorbed by their neighbors. It was the Grand Prince of Kiev, Roman the Great, to unite the pre-existing principalities of Alich in Galicia and Volhynia in a single state at the turn of the 13th century, making thus the Principality of Galicia and Volhynia existing as such. And after the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, so we are in 1239, 1241, the Prince Danilo Romanovich was forced to accept Mongol suzerainty under Batu Khan of the Golden Horde, right, as essentially the other princes of Rus did. As you know, this phase would last for centuries, as the Rus effectively became Mongol vassals, and also the modern Russia fundamentally emerged from that background that was in fact a very different one from the pre-Mongol invasion, when properly in terms also of political and social balance. And in a way, the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia represents in fact the westernmost, and what in fact was more similar to the original Kievan reality, right, that had in many ways much in common more with countries like Poland and Hungary, right? We made a video just a couple of months ago properly comparing PS Poland to the Kievan Rus, especially in the succession system and the general political institutional balance. And naturally the Rusians weren't happy of the Mongol yoke, so much that Danilo Romanovich tried, as we will see, to draw closer to Western Europe, also with formal recognitions that are the ones that effectively brought to the existence of the kingdom. That was an unusual title, in that in fact was recognized by the Pope in 1253. Danilo Romanovich was crowned as Rex Rusiae properly, and this made it still an Orthodox power, but subject to the Vatican, and as such the only polity stemming from the older Rurikid dynasty to become a kingdom proper. That was not a, as you know, the Kievan Rus was a principality, and a cluster of principalities was the Kievan preeminence, right, as the it was owed to the seniority of the princedom. And in this sense, Galicia-Volhynia was usually second, because it was normally, at least the pre-existing separated principates were often provided to the younger heirs of the Kievan Rus per se, and they were closer and somewhat also more, in fact, we've seen more developed properly, and also especially more kind of involved in the Western affairs than the rest of the Rus. And the ultimate attempt to, in fact, forge kind of Western connections to escape the Mongol orbit failed, not much because of our renewed Mongol suzerainty that still, as we will see, was there, right, and brought the same Rusians at some point to exploit it for their own aggrandizement, right, at the expense of same Westerners. This is especially the case of Galicia and Volhynia, but simply the decadence that had been triggered by, properly the public disruption of public authority, right, with Mongol invasion, this kind of autocratization of power that is effectively the sitting moment of Tsarism, also of this ferocious cultural model that is much at the root of modern Russian political and social reality, was created there to the detriment, in fact, of what the Kievan Rus, by declining in the latter period, was instead providing another model, right? It was a much more balanced system where the prince's rule was also mitigated by the one of the props or middle classes, but this was destroyed, was refeudalized and reprivatized on a Mongol model, right? And especially in the fringe areas of the Rus, you can't literally distinguish, even just in material culture, military culture, etc. We made videos on this. What is Mongol, what is Russian? Because factually they were the same, identical thing. And so in a sense, Galicia-Volhynia, we've seen it again in the series about modern contemporary Ukrainian history, saved itself because it fell in the mid 14th century in the Polish kingdom, and as such, having a very different history from the rest of the Russian territories. Polish King Casimir the Great, that in fact annexed the kingdom, adopted the title of King of Poland and ruler of Ruthenia. Ruthenia was this historical area, in fact, saying Galicia and Volhynia were, but over which the same kingdom, in fact, extended further control in the north, Black Ruthenia in the south, southwest, and the red one. And in fact, as we will see, also territorially stretching pretty much also latitudinally in an area that historically in Europe is also been associated to a general idea of of great strategic relevance for the control of the continent altogether, and that for centuries at that point was to be covered by Poland. Lithuanians would unite definitely in the modern age, and that in the more recent centuries instead has been contended by the Westerners and the Russians, and still today. It's no coincidence. And the territory at the moment of Polish annexation was properly made the province of Ruthenia actually later in 1434, right, officially, but it was known as such already before, more generally as the Palatinatus Russiae. And this, again, we've seen it in the other series, was the most thriving area of the Rus, right, and of the later Russia culturally, economically, it was the one that effectively would civilize and acculturate the same Muscovy later on. Geographically speaking, we're looking at an area extending between the rivers San and Dniepr. So, as we were saying at the beginning, mostly in eastern, southeastern Poland. Then the further eastern territories covered by the Pripyat marshes now in Belarus, and the upper reaches of the southern Bug River were the other extreme in modern day Ukraine. And the impressive set of neighbors, even just for the fact international implications of the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, were the Black Rus, in the north the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. We made a video on Lithuania this period to consolidate further its control on this fragmenting Rus after the Mongol invasion, also kind of sharing overlordship with Mongols over especially in the northern territories. The Principality of Turov-Pinsk, the Principality of Kiev, the Golden Horde was a hell of a power, which part of the Russian, in fact, elite was co-opted also militarily. The Kingdom of Hungary, the Kingdom of Poland, also the Principality of Moldova, and the monastic state of the Teutonic Knights. So the area of Galicia and Volhynia was occupied historically by peoples called the Budzans, Dulebs, and White Croats. So we're in the eastern branch of the Slavic family, and it had, as we've seen, as this westernmost area of the eastern Slavic region, it had also had some interesting overlappings. For example, with the Great Moravian State in the High Middle Ages. In 907, the White Croats and Dulebs are recorded to have participated to the Russian Prince Oleg of Novgorod military campaign against Constantinople, which tells you how the Rus was coalescing towards a greater political coordination and unitary leadership. The chronicler Nestor mentions the area in 981 when Vladimir the Great of Kievan Rus, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Prince of Novgorod, and ruler of the Rus, in fact, altogether, between the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century, essentially took over the land on his way to Poland, that with whom had important connections. And on this occasion, he founded the city of Voladimir, from which, in fact, the Volhynia, the Ludomiria, coming from Vladimir, emerges as a reality. The locals were Christianized in the process, at least formally. There were already Christians, and also the majority of people was not Christian yet. In the 12th century, also the Principality of Alich was formed by the descendants of the same Vladimir the Great. And as we were saying before, in 1199 there is the merging of the neighboring principalities of Volhynia and Galicia that were not always sticking together. There were problems naturally to rule the both. As we will see, it will be a pretty tormented story, but that would remain essentially as a unity for a while, at least before it was eventually split between Poland and Lithuania. This separation of the two principalities was again important for the political balance of the Kievan dynasty, because it was assigned, they were assigned on a rotating basis to younger members of the Rikids, and the proximity to Kiev was also relevant because, as we will see also later on, in the south of these lands was essentially the corridor between the steppes and the Danubian Valley, the Carpathians, that was of very, of great strategic relevance for Constantinople, and thus for the relations between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire, because from there, the steppe peoples that both Orthodox powers fought, such as the Kumans, etc., at that time they were also allies, however, would pass through there, and there were important trade connections also with the Black Sea coast from there, etc. The line of Prince Roman the Great, Voladimir, Roman Mstislavich, as we will see now, held the Principality of Volhynia historically, while the one of Yaroslav Osmomysl, the one of Alich, that would effectively be the Galician one, and the latter descending from Yaroslav I's eldest son, right? So they were all Rurikids practically, because that was the glue that kept this pretty wide set of principalities. So the creation of the single principality of Galicia and Volhynia happened after the death of Vladimir II Yaroslavich, in the Prince of Alich, when Roman the Great of Volodymyr acquired, in fact, the Principality of Galicia and united them in a single state. This happened again in 1198-9. We don't know exactly. In any case, the most important center was Galicia, right? So the Principality of Alich was normally the designation of this principality and the later kingdom, just because, in fact, Galicia was more developed. In general, it would remain historically. It was in the south, westernmost area, also close to the Carpathians, closer to the Black Sea, etc. And the importance of Volodymyr, however, remained, as factually was the second most important center after Alich itself. These Rusian princes were involved in extremely complicated political affairs. For example, Roman the Great captured Kiev in 1204. Also, he allied himself with Poland, made a peace treaty with Hungary, and engaged in diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire as well. So this made effectively the Principality already one of the most important regions of the Rus politically, just before the Mongol invasion. And in fact, there are claims that also this would have been, in theory, the most promising successor state to Kiev, and controlling Kiev was the key there, as the Third Rome suzerainty on it essentially equated to the recognition of the grand princely title status, and so the hegemony over the rest of the Rus. That, of course, was complicated, to say the least, but given that these were in fact the most advanced areas, it was still kind of what they enough, let's say, for them. So you understand also how, Volhynia and Galicia plus Kiev were just already the bulk of the Rus, practically, but they weren't kept for a long time together. I mean, Kiev especially. Also, Roman the Great married the same niece of the Byzantine Emperor Alexius III, which was at the base of a military alliance against the Kumans that at this point kind of threatened the communications properly between the Rus and Constantinople. And in fact, the objective was also extending from Galicia the control on the communities of the lower Dniester and lower Danube, that were, in this sense, crucial for not just properly the connections between the Rus and Constantinople, but also, for example, the control of the westernmost branch of the Silk Road that passed through the Danubian Delta, and still controlling the corridor between the Black Sea and the Carpathians for all the aforementioned reasons. In 1205, Roman also went at war with Poland, especially with Leszek the White, who was Prince of Sandomierz and High Duke of Poland intermittently for several times, and also Conrad of Mazovia. Roman was killed at the Battle of Zawichos in the same year, where his Druzhinas were ambushed by the Poles, and that eventually killed him. And so this brought to a situation of instability in the principality. As we were saying before, the westernmost areas of the Rus were heavily involved in Polish affairs and vice versa. Right? Historically, there had been also, the Polish intervention in Kiev, right? Things already. So there wasn't even properly a boundary, right? It's just in the previous centuries that this politics kind of consolidated, kind of a more differentiated territorial sphere of influence. Can't say like that, but better defined. But this politics on the boundaries, let's say, were at the frontiers, were always kind of interfering with each other and beyond. And the weakening of Galicia-Volhynia, followed to the death of Roman, brought the area to be, in fact, infiltrated by both Poland and Hungary. So much that at a certain point, the King Andrew II of Hungary styled himself as Rex Galiciae et Lodomeria. So, de facto, extending the Hungarian imperialistic idea on also beyond the Carpathians, that had always been, however, an Hungarian aim by a certain degree. And this title is particularly important because it would be resumed in the 18th century, the time of Maria Theresa, by the Habsburgs, right? Properly, the idea that there had been a kingdom effect. And Poland, however, wasn't just there watching, and in 1214 there was an agreement between the two kingdoms to, in fact, share the throne of Galicia-Volhynia by a marriage settlement, that is to say, the one between Leszek the White's daughter, Salomia, and Andrew's son, Koloman of Voladimir, in fact, who came to rule there, while his father was still king of Hungary, and also he had ruled other areas in Slavonia, also more towards the Adriatic, and he also controlled this area. However, the Rus wouldn't also be sitting ducks either. In 1221, Mstislavich, that was son of Mstislav Rostislavich, that was Prince of Smolensk and Novgorod, intervened in Galicia-Volhynia and freed it from the Hungarians. And this is an important moment because it shows, of course, naturally the precarity of the control on such fairly, even just medium distances, but by the 13th century it was not a few. Mstislav himself was the prince of Tarakan and Chernigov, right? So these were Russian princes that gravitated in general in the area of the, just the later Kievan Rus, let's say, before the Mongol invasion, that worked in order to establish some kind of control still on this, let's repeat it, rich area. But it was, however, Daniel Romanovich that was in fact the son of Roman the Great, who reunified and for good Volhynia and Galicia at this point, because that was not, let's say, it's still both principalities retained their own autonomy by a certain degree, but this union was cemented further, starting properly with the Romanovich dynasty. And the same Daniel in 1239 and again in 1242, showing this broader political instability, managed to capture Kiev, so de facto becoming Grand Prince of all Rus, keeping the city for the first time just a few weeks, while the second time only more than 1 year, a bit more than 1 year. And so this was this attempt of consolidating the control on the Grand Principality, if anything, from a formal point of view. But things were going downhill exactly in those years. Danilo, however, managed to defeat the Polish and Hungarian forces at the Battle of Yaroslav, and also their ally Rostislav Mikhailovich, that was the son of the Prince of Chernigov. This happened in 1245, so showing that there were ambitions, of course, from the same Russian area to still support the Hungarians and the Poles to be put on the throne of Galicia-Volhynia. In fact, the same Rostislav was a dignitary in the Kingdom of Hungary. Daniel also strengthened relations at this point with the Mongols, with Batu Khan. He traveled to what would have become, in fact, the major center, the capital of the Golden Horde, Sarai, on the Volga. And here he acknowledged formally the supremacy, in fact, of the Mongol Golden Horde, which was an important move, because at this point, of course, the Rus had been already invaded. The Mongols had de facto showed their imposing military capacity, and the disgregation of the entire system now was becoming evident properly. The war had disrupted, again, the socio-economical balance. The princes were taking over whatever they could, right? So even a formal recognition as a subject of the Golden Horde could mean a lot, right? And the westernmost position of Galicia and Volhynia here is quite interesting, because of course the Mongols would, as we will see in part also with the Galicia and Volhynia support, invade Poland thrice, right? At least they had already done it the first time at this point, and so the Rus couldn't quite escape, right? Just the north and maybe Novgorod, some areas, but those were still, however, reached by the political influence of the Golden Horde. But there was an advantage deriving from this. It's said that Daniel Romanovich at this point also reformed his army along the lines of the Mongol military, which is witnessed in general by Russian archaeology, because we see, the Russian culture was very conservative, and still, the icons, the Byzantine, the Roman classicistic mimicking of this kind of immutable order shows us this typically, in fact, kind of Byzantine type of armor. Also previous centuries in the great figures of the Russian princes and heroes. But when you look at material culture, you realize that the whole system was heavily Mongolized, as we were saying before. And this would be normal also because just in general, it was not just because of the Mongols. There had been many steppe peoples that the Rus had traditionally fought against that had left an important trace on arms and armor, etc. But reforming the military alongside the Mongol pattern also meant to affirm a sort of political model, right, that went along with it. It was one of a ever more autocratic force. And in general, there were all the political benefits deriving from a cooperation with the Mongols. But in fact, Daniel's alliance is considered mostly contingental. That is to say, it's not that they liked the Mongols, they wanted to maintain power and to also consolidate it further. And the Romanovich dynasty, in fact, will be kind of evidently going towards that direction, so that at the end of the day, as we were saying before, their land would fall mostly in the Western, the Central European control, so by it remaining culturally an Eastern one, Orthodox, and the ultimate goal was always to kind of resist to the Mongols, to aggrandize their power at the same time. They could play from Galicia and Volhynia on the distance of the peripheral position compared to other closer areas for the Mongols to reach. Now, in 1245, Pope Innocent IV allowed Daniel Romanovich to be crowned king. Again, so this tradition was kind of consolidated to receive from the papacy a recognition and a support that they also hoped to be more consistent, as Daniel asked for also military support, which never quite arrived, let's say, in an anti-Mongol fashion. And there was naturally a continuity of autonomy, if not de facto independence, ecclesiastically speaking, from Rome. But having such a powerful ally like the Pope in the West, especially also in the relations with other, in fact, Roman Catholic countries like Poland and Hungary, was important to kind of enter more in the Western games, right, and hoping also to gain some sort of military aid or crusade against the Mongols. Daniel was crowned king by the papal legate Opizio de Mezzano in Dorocin in 1253, and became thus king of all Rus, technically, because the title was Rex Russia, right? So it hinted at still the idea that the papal recognition was for the broader Rus, right? So making their guy the top one among all the others, which was an interesting papal footstep in Russian policies. In 1256, Daniel even managed to drive out the Mongols of Volhynia. He even thwarted their attempts to capture the cities of Lutsk. It was very important, and same Voladimir, even more. However, 4 years later, when a large army under the Mongol general Borodai approached, Daniel was forced not just to accept Mongol suzerainty, but also to raise the fortifications that he had built in the previous years to hold the enemy advance. However, still, this was the kind of the heyday of Galicia-Volhynia, and therefore of this kingdom of Rus, right? It was prosper, as we were saying before. It was factually the most culturally advanced in the Rus. The Galician-Volhynian Chronicle, that is an important source of the old Ruthenian literature and historiography, was written at the time. There was also demographic expansion, to which the settlement of German and Armenian colonists contributed. So this is an interesting connection between areas that were still, like, the Ostsiedlung was going on, right, and also even beyond, further east of the Rus. The same Armenians suffering their historical difficulties also, so this kingdom as a safe haven. In a way, the Mongols really weren't liked by anybody, so many would flee west. No, I'm kidding. I mean, somebody that was at some point also an important Christian tolerance, but was due always, to the pre-modern kind of tolerance, right? A balance also that would exploit trade, commerce, etc., where many Armenians in the same golden horde kind of making money. And there was a lot of trade that the Galicia-Volhynian kingdom was blessed by in a geographic sense because it stretched between essentially the Baltic, albeit not reaching it, but still being importantly connected to Lithuania, to Poland and the Teutonic Order, and the Black Sea especially. So the major cities were definitely benefiting from these fluxes. The most important at the time of Daniel's was Kolm, that he used as the capital, but naturally there was the same Voladimir, Alich, Pere, Michel, Doro, Hichen, and Terebovlia. And also Lviv, that would become properly the capital and the most important city of Galicia historically, as the court, the royal seat, would be shifted at the time of Daniel's son Lev from Kolm. Still, speaking of capitals, this period is a bit too much, but let's say from somewhere they would preferentially rule, right? So that's the indicator. This is still, after all, an expansion phase of the medieval civilization. So in spite of all the upheavals that had followed the Mongol invasions, it was an important expansion of power. Also, there is an interesting involvement of the Romanovich dynasty in Central European affairs that could have also changed a lot of things, as in 1252 Daniel managed to marry his son Roman to Gertrud of Babenberg, and we have seen this in the recent video about the Duchy of Austria. She was contending the ducal inheritance with her aunt Margaret, that eventually won, right? But Gertrud was being supported by Hungary, and the Margaret was being supported as she would also marry Ottokar II of Bohemia. And it's at the Battle of Kressenbrunn, excuse me, that the Bohemians, but important Austrian support, defeat the Hungarians that were claiming some sort of right on the Austrian ducal title, because the Hungarian king was related to Roman, right? And so he, having married Gertrude, was participating mostly on behalf of Hungary. And history could have gone differently, because if the Hungarians had managed to defeat the Bohemians, probably there might have been some kind of in fact Ruthenian involvement dynastically in Austria as well. This also shows how close historically, and they had remained, so it would remain, so the Western Russian affairs were to the Central European ones, even just as a form of mentality. This has been highlighted, right, by historiography, that Galicia, Volhynia, Poland, Hungary were shared some sort of mindset that was somewhat different from the rest of the Rus, for example, and also other Central European powers. And the same marriage of Roman with Gertrude shows how important dynastically the kingdom was at the time, internationally speaking, because you don't really marry someone to no one, right? Especially, the Babenberg heirs. So we're talking about some of the most compact feudal states in Central Europe, the Austrian case. Another son of Daniel, Schwarn, married a daughter of Mindaugas, that was Lithuania's first king, ruling briefly the country between 1267 and 1269, right? And in fact, as properly as Grand Duke of Lithuania, who was a very influential individual in the region, and in general, the Galician-Volhynian state had a glowing influence on the surrounding lands. It included the Red Rus, the Black Rus, as we've seen, the broader Ruthenian lands, but also, for example, the Brodnici tribe on the Black Sea, right, of disputed origin, if anything, rather than ethnicity, and that at this point also secured part of the fact of the maritime routes on the coast, as we were saying before. After Daniel Romanovich's death in 1264, his son Lev succeeded to him. In 1272, he moved the capital to Lviv, and his policy took a more Mongol course, if we can say so, as he tried to exploit at least the Mongol connection in order to, at the detriment of its western neighbors, right? Not really hoping the Mongols would actually concentrate power on the same kingdom, but on the contrary, kind of strengthen it, hoping probably to escape it. This is, in fact, particularly important considering also the moment of crisis in the 14th century followed to Lev's death, and that in a couple of generations will bring also to the loss of the independence. And probably there was not much of another option, you see, and this aggregative process that was evident of the Rus after one generation in general, and probably the beginning of the crisis, Eurasia, that was slowly beginning to be felt, and seeing the necessity also of kind of a more militarized, more warlike policy, also because of the same Mongol influence and models, was an important tool to affirm its fame and power. And there was in particular a very close alliance with the Khan Nogai of the Golden Horde, who was a great grandson of the same Genghis Khan, and also a notable convert to Islam at the time. In fact, Lev participated with Mongol allies to the invasion of Poland, right? And he got a lot of loot, raiding as far as Raciborz, coming back with deducing captives and other riches. However, this didn't win Galicia any territorial acquisition in Poland. That still, however, was, you see, there was just above the Carpathians, so there are not boundaries. It's a frontier area, so there would be, as we will see now, also some Rusian capacity to grab some pieces of Poland, but not quite lasting on the long run, and we'll see how. There was an attempt by Lev also to establish his family's rule over Lithuania. And this is interesting because we're still in a phase in which the Polish-Lithuanian connection was not formalized or even to be given for granted. Right? Initially, Lithuanians were still pagans, by the way, were enemies of the Poles. They raided their territories, like the Poles were the ones who essentially called the Teutonic Knights to cope with the Prussians, with other pagans in the area, and just instead realizing that the fall of Lithuania would have brought to disproportionate Teutonic power in the area. Also, Lithuania was desperate because they resisted a lot, also expanding in the south in Ruthenia, and therefore bonding with the Rus in a way, especially after the Mongol invasion that had made it soft and open to invasion, but let's say and allied with them to save them, and the same Lithuanians searching for that at that point. Lev's brother Schwarn ascended even to the Lithuanian throne in 1267, of which Lev was not happy at all. And for this reason, he actually killed the former Lithuanian ruler Vaishvilkas, that had actually retired to a monastery, so he spontaneously, by the way, and killed him because he was annoyed by the fact that he had just given power to his brother Svarna, not to him, interestingly enough. But the same Svarn lost the Lithuanian throne in 1269, and this brought to a more direct military intervention of the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia in Lithuania proper. In fact, there was a war lasting from 1274 to 1276 to crush the Lithuanian ruler Traidenis, that was the most important ruler, Grand Duke of Lithuania in the 13th century after the aforementioned Mindaugas. And the fortunes of war were adverse to the Rus, however, as Lithuania managed to defeat them and annexating the territory of Black Ruthenia, together with its city of Navadak, which was in general following the Lithuanian process of expansion in the south at the expense of the previous Russian lands, of which also the same Lithuania was greatly benefiting from a cultural point of view, because at that point, in fact, it's great part of the same literature, administration, etc., was civilizing Lithuania from the south, from the Russian Palatinate. At this point, Lev, 1279, allied himself with King Wenceslaus II of Bohemia, and he even invaded Poland together with him. There was an attempt to capture Krakow, so properly even the capital of the Polish kingdom, that was very fragmented at the time. But this episode in 1280 still was another military failure. Things could have easily changed, but you realize how here a Ruthenian ruler could even just enter Poland and manage to seize the capital, the most important city in the kingdom. Pretty troubled times in general. Lev, however, was successful, finally, at least against Hungary, managing to annexate parts of Transcarpathia, right, including the city of Munkac. There, the Hungarians had never exercised a full control on the Carpathians, because they were always kind of autonomous areas, very difficult to control, but at least Hungary was the hegemonic power, and the Rus exploited this permeability, at least. Also, there was another victory over Poland in 1292, which won the Kingdom of Rus the city of Lublin and surrounding territory. Lublin, being in the southeast, so properly at the frontier there with the Rus. And however, the city would be lost after a short while, so there wasn't any major consequence strategically to that. As we were saying before, when Lev died, things started going downhill for the kingdom. He was succeeded by his son Yuri, who ruled, however, for only 7 years, and then albeit the kingdom was largely pacified, right, and it was also fairly prosper. The Poles retook Lublin in 1302, and there was a double rule from 1308 to 1323 by Yuri's sons Andrew and Lev II, who proclaimed themselves both kings of the Rus. And These brothers forged an alliance with King Vladislav I of Poland and the Teutonic Order against the Lithuanians and the Mongols, because the latter had basically the intention of sharing at that point. Lithuania had expanded, as we've seen, importantly towards the south, and it was essentially planning, together with the Mongols, to rule the Rus in a sort of shared overlordship. These were also, as we've seen, just ever more privatized areas. There was literally no state. The kingdom here being practically the only major polity having some, let's say, some capacity of regional intervention and influence. And so it was easy for the Lithuanian noblemen to just have their estates in the south, in Ruthenia, and then going to fight in the same Lithuania while it was under constant attack by Teutonic knights. And so they wanted their rear secured, and would share with the Mongols this kind of agreement to pressure the Rus. So hence the same Rus alliance with Poland, and that was temporarily kind of okay with this anti-Lithuanian attitude, and especially the Teutonic Order was actually the major force there pressuring on Lithuania. However, this explains the same reason why they did it. The kingdom was still tributary to the Mongol Golden Horde. So this meant that in order to exist, not having retaliatory expeditions, etc., the kingdom had to pay a tribute, right? That was a boulder by those time standards, still on, not just on international prestige, but also and consequently too, for the local resources could be invested elsewhere, right? So this was a big deal. And the two brothers actually participated to Mongol expeditions under Uzbek Khan and his successor Yanibek Khan. These were very important political figures. They had literally they intervened in a very wide-scale ranging policy from China to Egypt. I mean, it was really something. However, Andrew and Lev II died together in battle in 1323, fighting against the same Mongols, and they left no heir. So this brought, sadly enough, to the extinction of the Rurikid dynasty in the Kingdom of Rus in 1323. Just think even how long and how much greatness and legacy and and properly meaning and symbols that this had up to that point. And it was a pretty sad thing in perspective, also properly for how the Rus had ended up like after the Mongol invasion, especially. Of this extinction, Lithuania profited immediately as they seized control of Volhynia under Prince Liubartas, and this was happening while basically the Lithuanian boyars were swarming in Galicia as well and settling in it as local rulers. So much the same Lithuanians invited Prince Boleslav Yuri II, a grandson of Yuri I, that, as we have seen, was essentially Lev the First's son, to assume the Galician throne, as to say, well, you're still related to the older dynasty, so you can, you can be of use as a symbol, as a sort of tool to legitimize our rule here with a sort of traditional continuity. And the same Boleslav converted to Orthodoxy, right? He was a foreigner, point of Catholic by birth, because he was actually the son of Troidan I, Duke of Mazovia, right? And so he was actually a Piast himself as a consequence of becoming as a Pole. And he assumed the name of Yuri II. But since the local nobility was, sensing that he was not really a fervent Orthodox and rather, more sympathetic to Catholicism, they poisoned him in 1340 and elected a ruler on their own. It was known as Dmitry Detko, who led the Galician state for a while. And in winter 1341, the Mongols, the Ruthenians, led by Detko, and the Lithuanians, led by Lyubartas, managed even to defeat the Poles in some reversal, in fact, until they were defeated themselves the following season. And this brought to the final recognition by Detko of Polish overlordship, becoming a starost of Alich. The starost was a traditional title, like the local elderly that was seen here, in fact, as a more kind of representative figure rather than effectively one of command. When Detko died, Casimir III invaded and conquered Galicia in 1349 for good. And so this brought to the end of the Galician-Volhynian state, at least as an independent reality. And this is made all more interesting by the fact that the Galician-Volhynian dynasty had, as we have seen, a tradition of papal support, right? And in the 14th century, they had been asking this troubled moment from Pope Benedict XII support, right? Especially in this moment when the idea of the crusade against the Turks, the Mongols, was coming back on the fore, right? As you know, it wasn't much of a... There were crusades in Asia Minor. There was still this threat posed by the Golden Horde with launch offensives as deep as Poland or the Danubian Valley, etc. And that objectively bothered the eastern flanks of Western Christendom. But this Russian connection with the papacy, and let's stress it again, we're still an Orthodox power trying to receive this help, wouldn't actually make Galicia-Volhynia escape from the essentially the decentralizing policy, the expansionistic policy of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and of the Kingdom of Poland. That especially where Lithuania would become Catholic, Poland was importantly Catholic at that point already for a long time, and annexating herself, in fact, Galicia-Volhynia in 1349. The Hungarians participated to that conquest as well. And this also ended the vassalage of the Kingdom of Rus to the Golden Horde, but still, passed to Poland. And this was an important, let's say, setting that would last for centuries, right, up to the 18th century, actually, where up to the partitions of Poland, as a matter of fact. And we've again made videos about that, how also the modern Ukrainian national identity was essentially boosted in Habsburgic, Galicia, etc., and how this territory remained very influential for Eastern European standards, especially also in the Muscovy later on in the 18th century. And therefore, we're talking about a power that didn't quite make it, as you understand. It was significantly crippled by the same Mongol presence, but that somehow managed to maintain its own uniqueness, its own church, in practice, and its own culture, and its own language, largely. There was also troubles were not over. Like if the second half of the 14th century, there were important strifes between Lithuania, Poland, and Hungary. Was really a mess, right? And in a treaty of 1344, so before the annexation, there was a first inclusion of the Principality of Peremysl to the Crown of Poland. The rest was ruled by the Lithuanian Gediminis family in the person of Liubartas. And still later on in the mid-14th century, kind of Poland, as we've seen in Lithuania, divided the spoils of the former Galicia and Volhynia in a particular way, because Poland got Western Volhynia and Galicia, right, while Eastern Volhynia would pass to Lithuania between 1350 to 1366. After they had, I think the eastern part also had been annexed by Poland originally, this Ruthenian voivodeship, so this province in the Polish kingdom, would remain as such also after the union of Lublin in 1569 between Poland and Lithuania, that officialized this frontier between these borders between the two, and that would bring in fact to important cultural mechanisms that make these areas fall into, but like in the Polish or Lithuanian area, that had different stories. And speaking of Alich, it was the most important city originally. The center, just make you understand how time changes things, is not really the one of the modern day town of Alich, right? But it was something 5 kilometers away, right, in the location of today where the old town river port was located, right? And here King Liubartas constructed a wooden castle in 1367. And it's only in 1772 that the idea of the kingdom was resumed, right? I think for a while also the Lithuanians bore the title of Kingdom of Rus or something, but it's Empress Maria Theresa of Austria that resumed as Queen of Hungary the claims to the kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, right? The older title, Regnum Galiciae et Lodomeria. And this was after the partition of Poland. So, given this mantle of legitimization on the base of a previous Hungarian claim that at that point was an Habsburgic thing. So if we were to look at the broader role of Galicia-Volhynia, we see that there was a sense, for example, the local chronicle written in the 1200 stresses the fact that the Romanovich dynasty was the most deserving, or at least properly the officially recognized, to inherit the Kievan principality, and therefore the third Rome as this, if anything, a political see, because the ecclesiastical one wasn't really asked by, was never sought after by the Galician Volhynians. And given that Daniel Romanovich had been kind of the most powerful ruler, the last ruler of Kiev, also in spite of the difficulties that he had in maintaining the city, that this would make him properly the direct continuator of the Grand Principality, thus making it, and we've seen it also with the papal crowning, etc., the ruler of all the land of Rus, which is quite interesting. It is a title, in fact, it was battled in Rus between various factions. In fact, if you look at the seal of King Yuri I, there is this Latin inscription, Domini Georgi Regis Rusiae, right? Yuri being for George, of course. And the major contendant to this title was the Vladimir Suzdal Grand Duchy, that instead had also greater ecclesiastical ambitions, because as you know, Vladimir would be effectively the see where the Kievan, the Rus church migrated, right? Before it also was essentially taken away from Moscow, but also the legitimacy of these mechanisms was not really there, and on the contrary, much properly of the legacy, ecclesiastical legacy of the Rus was actually present in Galicia-Volhynia for many reasons. If anything, properly the best of the clergy in terms of cultural, literary, artistical standards, etc. was there. And again, the Galicia-Volhynia spread an enormous amount of cultural fallout all around, all over Eastern Europe, to civilize basically it, because there was no other land in Eastern Europe that was more advanced than it. And as we've seen, there is also this interesting relation with Poland and Hungary that was much older than we consider, because when we say we Kievan Rus, but then if you look at the story of various principalities, they had all very different stories. Well, the one of Galicia-Volhynia is definitely the one of a very close proximity to Central Europe, right? As in part it would remain, as also for the presence of some historically of some Polish or German element, even though being still an Eastern European and Slavic Orthodox reality, and kind of maintaining that identity also through all these vicissitudes, because it wouldn't require any political independence until properly contemporary Ukraine emerged, right? So the interesting aspect of this Russian lens is that, differently, for example, from Novgorod, that was an enemy of Westerners during the Crusades with Teutonic Knights. Think about Alexander Nevsky, that story. These Rus were kind of close with the West, even receiving properly the royal title by the Pope, and becoming virtually the subjects of the Vatican. So this proximity, I would say, culturally speaking, is extremely fascinating, because these are the same areas that eventually would make the modern Ukrainian nation emerge. And so this shows how this country is deeply connected properly to a Western reality, right? Think about even Lviv/Lvov, the little Vienna in a way, and properly all an habituation to, say, the correlation with other powers, foreign elements, and two, even the absorption of Polish, for example, as language of culture later on in contemporary age, modern contemporary age, let's say, and coexisting with the local Ukrainian one. And this is very, very interesting in our times to think. And so this kingdom, and we will naturally make at some point some videos about the previous principality of Galicia, and the principality of Volhynia, because those also are, in previous times, the lands of the Rus. In fact, this is the first video we make specifically on a sub-principality of the broader Kievan one, right? So we will hopefully keep completing the picture in this regard. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.